This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard given on the 26th of July, 1954. The title of this lecture is Opening Procedure of 8C. This lecture is 31 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Arrow Productions.
I want to talk to you now about the opening procedure of 8C. This is a very, very interesting subject, a tremendously interesting subject. It's fascinating, utterly fascinating, exactly what you can do with a process which is apparently as permissive as opening procedure of 8C. Now, there's no need for me to go in particularly to the exact way that it's all written up. You'll find it in issue 24G of the Journal of Scientology. But it is very fascinating, the number of side effects which are cared for, because you are processing straight toward simplicity. We know that what is wrong with a person is his subjective universe. That has gotten into trouble. Now, in view of the fact that he could mock up a tremendous amount of space if he had to, he could mock up lots of energy, he could mock up objects, and he could follow the same procedure all over again, why he's lugging around something called his universe is a little bit difficult for a reasonable man to understand. And yet people do this. Thetan gives a sort of the idea of somebody walking around with a great many clanking chains, all carefully hidden away even from himself, old tin cans, old cigar butts, so forth. And these are possessions. It looks like a kid's toy box, if you've ever looked into 3-year-olds' choicest possessions. That's strictly about the order of havingness the thetan pulls. Well, this is quite interesting because he gives them up with the greatest of reluctance, and yet he could make others. And his total health, you might say, is dependent upon his ability to make others, to have new, fresh things, to do almost anything he wants to with them. But remember, it was always very, very difficult for him to get an object into such a circumstance that it was actually somebody else's object. How do we see that? To procure an object which was somebody else's object is what he has to do in order to have that object. Now, if we look at the 4 conditions of existence, the ises, we'll discover just exactly why. And these things are very valuable to him because they mean a period when he was actually in communication with thetans as such, and he could blame them, you see. And if he could blame them, then he could have something. And if he couldn't blame them, then he couldn't have anything, unless he duplicated himself and so had another thetan in order to blame the other thetan for something or other. In this way, he would get a persistence. He would get survival then in terms of motion. Otherwise, it would all seem completely motionless to him. Now, again, all of these things are simply considerations. And in view of the fact that they're all considerations, we're enormously baffled as to how considerations could be so important. Remember, they're only important because of the considerations which one held in common with others. Now, it'd be one thing simply to change one's considerations all over the place. And it would be quite another thing to have a series of considerations which had been thoroughly agreed upon with others. And so, your thetan, with his old cigar butts, torn playing cards, and clanking chains. He's been in communication one time or another, and the system of communication was established, and therefore he could have another determinism so true and so convincing that even he, you see, would not be able to question its convincingness, and therefore nobody could possibly question the validity of these objects which he's carrying around. Now, you'll find out in some areas where thetans have been in concourse with nothing but thetans, there's such a thing as engram police. And there's all kinds of mechanisms that they use in order to steal mock-ups from each other. And it's really fabulous. They try to get an overt act done to them. In other words, get a motivator. Simply then they will have some reason to blame somebody else, you see, for having put that mass of energy there. And then that energy mass will persist. If they can't blame anybody else, why, it can too easily become an as-is. When we look over this problem, then, we discover that an individual can go so far on this line and become himself disabled. How does he become disabled? He begins to count on other determinism more and more and more heavily to produce his own survival. We see this in terms of attention. An individual in this society without any attention from anybody else would not have much chance of surviving. An individual just on the basis of food alone would have a great difficulty. But he's gotten down to where those objects really have to be solid, and so we get this physical universe. And the particles of this physical universe are so beautifully lost, so completely confused, so misplaced away from their point of origin, that they can be subjected to a law in physics known as the conservation of energy. Energy cannot be destroyed, it can only be converted. Of course, anything that lost can only be converted, you see, unless you discover the point where it was actually manufactured. And so this universe becomes valuable. It becomes valuable because we've gone to so much trouble to lose enough things so that we then have a continuance of objects. Now, a thetan who has become upset about the various agreements and so on believes that he no longer can communicate with something. He is a nothingness, therefore he has to communicate with a nothingness, he thinks. The communication formula is at fault. Here we have an individual who is living by the communication formula and yet cannot recover his own ability easily to follow the basic of communication, which is all things are on the same point. When you consider a consideration, you find out it doesn't have any dimension whatsoever, and a thetan has no dimension whatsoever. So he's gone to a lot of work to make a universe that's as heavy as this one. And he's blamed it all on God, and he's blamed it all in various directions, and he has made what amounts to a considerable investment. He has a big investment, and now he has gone so far that having made this investment, he can no longer look at it, because he has to follow the communications formula. He cannot occupy the same space as an object. Two objects cannot occupy the same space. So therefore he is a body. He is not a thetan plus body. He is a body. Every once in a while we run into some materialist in processing, and just the barest thought, you see, that he is something else other than a body is completely contradictory to him. It's utterly assaulting. You'd think that you would have held a gun on the man and ask him for his money or something. You become excited. I am a body. I know I am a body. That is all I am. I am one. Exclamation point, exclamation point. He gets real worried about it. This person at the same time is liable to be that person you will run into who is most concerned with God. This is real curious, isn't it? Well, he has to have another determinism for responsibility. Also, his field will be relatively black. No criticism of the individual, it's just the state he's in. Why? He knows two things can't occupy the same space. So obviously, if he is there and the body is there, then he must be the body. That's the most elementary thing we could possibly put together. That's very observant, isn't it? Well, this individual has himself mocked up as something and is being something so thoroughly that he cannot disassociate himself. And we are processing something which has head and he can't be 3 feet back of his head. There is the thetan and his machines. Now, there's two parts. And the other parts are the body and its reactive bank. You see? Now, there are actually 4 parts. There's a reactive bank, a stimulus response machine of some magnitude, and the body, which actually is capable of collecting an enormous amount of molecules and electrons and converting energy and doing all sorts of interesting things. Well, that's one unit, and the other unit is the thetan in his machines, but we're actually processing 4 things. Now, an auditor occasionally makes the gross error of processing one of these things, not the thetan. See, he processes the reactive bank. This is a mistake today. I mean, the technologies which we have and so forth do not justify the processing of the reactive bank. It just doesn't justify it. So there's that many engrams. So there are that many engrams. Well, does this so assault our sensibilities that these things exist, that we must vanquish and make every one of them disappear? Well, if he got another body, it'd have another reactive bank. And so what we want to do is improve the thetan's ability to handle reactive banks, to be in association with them or not, at will. That's what we want to improve. Not knock out a whole reactive bank. You say that'd be silly. Now, the next thing, the body. The auditor comes along and he starts processing the body, the body, the body, the body, the body, the body. Oh my, our pre-clear, look at, he has a slight cold today. Oh, wonderful. Now we've got something to process. Well, what kind of an auditor would this be? It'd be an auditor who had to have something. This auditor couldn't possibly have nothing because he's actually processing nothing. He's trying to free a nothingness. And if he can't conceive of a nothingness, if he has to go in the direction of a somethingness, even though he is making nothing out of every somethingness he runs into, you know, with energy, not is, this auditor, of course, will process straight at this case of snivels. And you know what he'll do with that case of snivels? He'll have it next. But what's he doing processing a body? A body, you see, is very easy. They're easy to make, patch up, do almost anything with, if a thetan is able. All right, now let's take this next thing, machines. Every once in a while, some pre-clear has such an observable surplus of machinery that an auditor just can't stand leaving that machinery alone. He just can't stand it. He's got to get in there and get all of those mechanisms out of the road and get them all mopped up and wiped out and so forth. Next thing you know, the thetan is very, very sad indeed. Because what would this thetan do? And look at all the years he spent blaming this machinery on somebody else. He's got this little voice, and it keeps piping up every time he says something, saying, that was a smart one, that was. You know? And this little voice does this, and it's very worrisome to him. That's his mother's voice, so it's obviously his mother that's doing this. He made this machine a long time ago and put it off on somebody else. He even made a machine to make machines so that he wouldn't be responsible for it. And he even makes machines to add to his machines the machine duplicates of other people. Oh, he's got complex machinery. But when you've gotten through processing all this machinery, what have you done? You've just processed some machinery, and it wasn't sick. So we have these 4 major parts, and of these 4 parts, what are we trying to process? We're trying to process the thetan. Well, of course, he doesn't have any mass, but he can make space, and he can make energy, and he can locate objects in space, and he has certain very definite capabilities, very positive, definite capabilities, and by the improvement of these capabilities, we improve his ability to communicate. And so improving his ability to communicate, we make him able to handle not just the reactive bank he's mixed up with at the moment, not just the body he happens to be inhabiting or hanging around at the moment, and certainly not his bank of machinery. We make it possible for him to handle large quantities of, well, other people's machinery and various other things. It's very interesting what he can do. But he cannot possibly be hung up on the basis of 2 things can't occupy the same space. He couldn't be hung up on that one. Another thing he couldn't be hung up on, if you're going to separate him easily, is that it's all other determined. You see, if it's all other determined, then he would depend on other things to place him in space. And if he's depending on other things to place him in space, he will sit there and wait for the auditor to exteriorize him. But the auditor's not going to exteriorize him. So our point of approach here is the thetan. Now the easiest way to approach this is simply on make and break communication with the immediate environment. Now I'd better define environment. Environment is the physical universe, security, gee whiz, it's right there, it's solid. This is the space of the room, the floor, the ceiling, the walls, the objects there. And if we happen to get looking through these things, then it's the walls in the next room, and up through the roof, why, it's the air above the house, and down through, it's the earth underneath the house. But this is still environment, you understand. And environment means how far can this individual perceive with great certainty in the physical universe. And that's what we're interested in when we say environment. Now, we don't have the pre-clear in Chicago, and because he is an inhabitant of Iowa, then process him in the environment of Iowa. Now, this sounds too utterly stupid that nobody could do this, but believe me, auditors have done this. Process him in the environment. Well, this fellow's environment was New Mexico. So they process him one state away. And what will they be processing? They'll be processing a set of facsimiles. Are we interested in this man's facsimiles? No, we're not. Now, there's a direct ratio between the amount of facsimiles or energy masses a person has and his ability to communicate. There's a direct ratio between these two things. The more energy masses and more facsimiles which a person has, whether white or green or purple, or whether they're black curtains or actual apparent solid objects, we don't care what these are. The more energy mass the individual has, the worse off he is. It's a direct index. This fellow, he runs a concept and gets a flow past his face. You know, he feels something moving past his face. Ah, we've got a case of energy masses. How did they get there? They got there by the thetan directing his attention in various directions, manufacturing energy the while. And you're going to process this case as a pre-clear, this thetan, in such a way that he sprays out new energy masses around his body? That'd be a curious thing, wouldn't it? And yet, you know, there are processes that you could run, not any listed in intensive procedure, which would lead an individual to immediately mock up more and more and more and more energy masses in the vicinity of his body. You could actually artificialize his condition. He's as well off as he doesn't have to have energy masses. He has to have energy masses to the degree that he believes he cannot create a space and energy. See, that's a direct index. So we find somebody who has large floating ridges and that sort of thing, and this individual is having just that much difficulty. Just that much. Direct index. No question about it and no exceptions. Doesn't matter what manifestation we're exhibiting at the particular moment, a person is as bad off as he has these energy masses, which are not placed but are floating. You could say they're floating energy masses, because everywhere he walks, he's got them. Now, he's as well off as he can simply take or leave the walls and other items of the physical universe where he finds himself. See, he can take them or leave them, see them or not see them at will. Now, he's well off when he can do that. Now, what process would you tailor up in order to accomplish this? Well, you could just simply have a pre-clear sitting in a chair and looking around the room, spotting spots. You know, you spot spots in the wall, and spot spots, and spot spots, spot spots. It's a fantastic technique. It'll do quite a bit for a pre-clear. Just have him sit there and look at the walls and spot spots. Well, actually, you can start adding to this the moment that you have him get up and walk around and pick out the spots and touch them and then break communication with them. And HC is actually a gradient scale. HC's opening procedure is a gradient scale of getting this done. But there is an additional process that could go along with this. You could make him close his eyes and have him start checking off spots in the environment. The case that has had his perception turn on very fully and then promptly turn off, and has never been on since, has simply practically scared himself out of his wits. See, his perception turned on, and that was too much isness. He could see everything too clearly, and this made him nervous, it upset him, it disturbed his thetan digestion, and has made him very, very unhappy. And what is this? This is just simply a case of too much, and he said, it isn't. See, he said, not is, and took a look at all this environment and said, dull down. Get real dull. It's better be unreal around here. It's just too bright, it's too loud, and so on. Well, what happens if we have this person sitting there in the chair with his eyes shut and we just have him look around the room? You know, have him look around and spot spots in the room. All right, a facsimile shows up. We just have him go on spotting spots in whatever he can see, which is, we're still heading at the room. We don't suddenly stop and say, oh, you got a lot of blackness. Let's spot some spots in the blackness. No, you just keep hounding him for some sort of a perception of the room. That's what you want. And he keeps spotting spots in the room and spotting them and spotting them and spotting them and spotting them. Just that, no more. Spotting them behind him, above him, below him. If you don't watch him a little bit, he'll spot them all in front of him. You've got to direct his attention behind us. Thetan has a 360-degree periphery of vision. There is no behind, get thee behind me, thetan situation. Now, here we have in a thetan, then, a possibility that the moment he really saw the room, he'd turn it off again. Is that right? He'd flinch. Well, the funny part of it is they do. They do flinch. And then you keep right on processing the room. You see what this would be? I mean, they'd flinch, their perception would go off, and you just take it from there and have him spot spots in the room. So he says his perception's all off. Will you just have him find something he can perceive? But he said, I think it's a facsimile. I don't know what it is really. It doesn't seem to me to be terribly real. Yap. You just say spots some more spots. Now, in other words, we could go at this then on this basis. We just simply have a fellow, pretty clear, close his eyes and start spotting spots in the room. And the auditing commands go along with it. All right, you'd say just close your eyes. Okay, now let's spot some spots in the room. Oh, the fellow said, what do you mean, close my eyes and spot? Well, can you see anything when you got your eyes shut there? No, of course not. Well, why don't you look around? Do you get an impression of anything? Well, what do you know? It's all black. He never noticed this before. You'll say, well, all right, how about this now? You say it's all black. Well, is there any place that's thinner? You know, behind you, for instance, or above you, or below you. Do you make out anything at all about this room? No. Well, as you're sitting there with your eyes closed, do you know the location of anything in this room? Yeah, well, I know where my body is. Of course, a case like this would probably assert to you violently, if they weren't prepared otherwise, to tell you that they were a body, they had always been a body, they would always be a body, they've never been anything else but a body, that you lived but once. And they would also tell you that during their study of Korzybski's Science and Sanity, they agreed with him utterly that two things could not occupy the same space. They'll tell you all these things. It would be a very informative conversation if you let him proceed. You only let him proceed on such a conversation, by the way, long enough to keep the two-way communication going. Then you get him doing something. All right? You'd say, well, do you know of the location of any object in this room? And the fellow says, well, there's a table right over there. I know that. Well, why don't you look at it? And if you don't catch him real quick, why, his eyes will pop open, of course, and he will stare at it. But you keep him with his eyes closed, and he knows there's a table over there, and you say, all right, spot some spots in it. I can't possibly spot any spots in the table if I can't see it. Do you know it's there? Yes, I know it's there. I saw it when I came in. Well, all right, spot some spots on it, but I'll have to open my... and go ahead and spot some spots on that table. He finally does. And it starts to get a tattletale gray around him. And then it flickers on and it flickers off, and perception comes on, and all of a sudden he's aware of the fact that it's all real. And then he convulsively shuts off all of his perception, and then he lets it turn on again, and then he shuts it off again, and then he flinches in this way and flinches in that way. Why? He knows it's dangerous to look at things. He knows that. He knows, again, it is dangerous to communicate. And he shuts it off before something else shuts it off. See? He's there ahead of him. But after it goes on and comes off and goes on and comes off a few times, it's liable to be more and more upsetting to him all the time. It's because it's liable to be getting more and more real. The room is liable to be getting more and more real, more and more solid. Now, if you let him continually and completely fly out through the doors and the walls and so on, and let him spot at unreal distances, such as spotting at 1,000 yards for somebody who actually, if he hadn't come to you for processing, he would have been using a tin cup shortly and a pair of dark glasses and some pencils. This character and so forth, spotting at 1,000 yards, oh yeah? 1,000 millimeters would be much too great, and 3 millimeters is about what he can tolerate. So we keep him in the immediate environment, and we mean the physical universe when we say environment, and we mean objects that he's fairly sure are there, and we just work him on that basis. And the first thing you know, the walls will start to disappear, and then they'll flicker on again, and they'll flicker off, and it gets more and more real, and he gets upset about it, and then he becomes calm about it, and he goes through a lot of variations. Doing what? Just sitting right where he's sitting, and you don't care where that is, spotting spots in the room, whether the room is black, green, purple, or whether he's got facsimiles that he's really spotting or not. We don't care what this pre-clear's doing, as long as he continues to spot spots. If he's got a facsimile sitting there, and he shifts his attention on the facsimile, he'll let go of it. You see? If he's really just spotting into blackness and so forth, if he's really changing his perception, direction, you see, why, boom, he'll start looking through the blackness. If you have him look at the blackness and spot spots in the blackness, you are validating these masses of energy I mentioned to you. And a thetan is as bad off as he has them. What he's witnessing with all of these possessions and masses of energy is his own inability to really mock up something and have it belong to somebody else. That's what he's witnessing when he can't do it. So there is that process. Now, out of these two processes, you can do opening procedure of 8C. But you can also do opening procedure of 8C with the thetan, without moving the body. You can have the thetan touch things in the room. But actually, you don't have him touch things and let go. You have him look at and look away. And you can carry through all the steps of the room by more or less drilling the thetan in the room, pre-clear, sitting there with eyes closed. And this becomes a tremendously workable procedure. Actually, its most simple form is just tell him to close his eyes. If he knows of any object in the room at all while he has his eyes closed, spot spots in it. Now, the classic group example of this is a very simple one, and that is 3 spots in the body, 3 spots in the room, 3 spots in the body. You have them spot 3 spots in the body, 3 spots in the room, 3 spots in the body, 3 spots in the room, back and forth. And at the end of this time, after the end of an hour's group processing on perfectly green people, a bunch of 20, something like this, you'll have 4 or 5 of them exteriorized. Usual run of people you run into, unless you're dealing, of course, with mystics 100% of the time. That's a little more difficult. Now, 8C done with the body, however, 8C done with the body, and with no further tricks, with its most elementary auditing commands, as given in Intensive Procedures text, is the only process, oh, please mark this one down, please remember this, it's the only process which can be safely employed and beneficially employed on psychotics, neurotics, and people with psychosomatic illnesses let's put that down and recognize that when a pre-clear comes in with a psychosomatic illness, he has already determined exactly the processing he's going to get. And I call your attention to the chart of human evaluation, to the place where it says neurological and endocrine ills. Well, that's where they sit on psychosomatic ills. It's down below 2 on the tone scale. And they are physically off their base. And what it takes and what will make that psychosomatic ill go away is opening procedure of 8C. And it'll cure psychotics and it'll cure neurotics. Because in essence is a purity of communication and is a very simple process to use. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to be an artist to use it. Okay.
This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard given on the 26th of July, 1954. The title of this lecture is Handling of Theta Bodies. This lecture is 30 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Arrow Productions.
Okay, what might we clarify on this? This whole talk this morning could have been on the basis of why 8C works. I intended to talk to you about something else this morning in addition to this and didn't get a chance to cover it. And that is the handling of these things called theta bodies and so forth. Every once in a while you exteriorize a pre-clear and you find him in a theta body or something of the sort. Actually, you try to do very much with this body and you get terribly confused about what you were doing. Well, the truth of the matter is the body isn't in this universe, it's in another universe, but it is in this universe. That's one of those horrible maybes. And all you do with it is simply run exteriorization by distance. You can run 8C, you see, and then start running exteriorization by distance. What distance could he tolerate? This is a fast way to run it. What distance could he tolerate to this body? What distance could the body tolerate to him? These bodies are sometimes rigged up to be very agglutinous, very sticky. Once in a while you run into a pre-clear. He puts his, quote, hand, as a thetan. He's got a black theta body or a demon body or something of the sort, and he'll have exteriorized sometime or another. He'll put his hand against a physical universe wall, and his hand will stick. Scares him. Boy, that really scares a pre-clear. He goes back inside, and you have a hell of a time fishing him out. Well, the joke in that case is the hands of such a body are tailored to do that. It isn't that that wall will stick to a thetan, but it'll stick to a body which is tailor-made to stick to a wall. Want it? And they get these when they get anxious about handling and controlling bodies. They'll mock up or get or steal or do something with, get a hold of a body and control this body with this other body. They can't slide out of this body then as long as they've got another superimposed body on it. And that's a black body. Very, very curious. Sometimes has cat feet. Sometimes has small ears. Sometimes has a long tail. Sometimes it's damn near visible. Sometimes they have eyes on the side of the body, out to the side, just to frighten people more than anything else. Sometimes they have cat faces. Sometimes the faces are horrible dead things, completely deadpan. And so on. It's really weird business. But they're just made out of a set of postulates, just like this body you're sitting in right this minute. Well, now, if exteriorization is so awfully important, Why aren't we doing more of it right this minute? Or are we? Hmm? That's right. Now, this unit has had a considerable amount of experience. Has had considerable experience on the subject of the processes in intensive procedure. Friends, I've thrown most of these processes at you, whether cases should have had them or not. All of these processes have a certain workability. The main mistake which you will make in running processes, in running pre-clears, is trying to shortcut it through, trying to get in an awful hurry, see, and run some process which produces an immediate and fabulous result upon the pre-clear, merely by throwing him into a minor convulsion or something of the sort, rather than run something that does something effective and lasting on the pre-clear. And I threw quite a few processes at you for your experience in using processes, because every pre-clear has its workability, and you follow intensive procedure down the line, you'll be amazed at how many people simply will take route 1 and stick on it. You'll just be amazed how many will. They just run right on down Route 1 and be outside and be in nice condition, and that's that. Pat them on the head. If they hit Route 2, or if they've got comm lags on the subject of ARC and hit Route 2, why, you really have a job of collection on your hands. Let's get enough of his attention in the immediate environment so that he isn't being continually distracted by occurrences, motions, and so forth in other universes, in the bank, and elsewhere. And then he will exteriorize fairly well. Now, a person who has to be collected like that is actually best exteriorized by exteriorization by distance. That's a very fine process for exteriorizing it. Just run as it's given in the handbook. Sometimes you run exteriorization by distance on somebody that you've already got out, and he'll discover he really is out. There's another method. Now, another thing is you can run HC on a pre-clear who is exteriorized. You can run it on the thetan. Now, it's the thetan that's stuck all over universes. It isn't the body. But the body might delusively believe that it is, or something like that. We don't care anything about that. We don't care about that. 2 cents worth. The body is itself a sort of a universe. It has eyes to look with, and it's occupying, making a certain amount of space. Then the process of processing, you'll find out that the main mistake you make in processing is not running HC, opening procedure, long enough upon your pre-clear. And then, having done that, you should, of course, run some opening procedure by duplication if your pre-clear is rough. After you run some HC, but remember, run enough HC before you run opening procedure by duplication. Collect them. Now, the other day I ran somebody who was exteriorizable, exteriorized rather easily, simply bapped them out of their head, and ran them very nicely and so forth. They were coal black, they couldn't see well, they didn't know quite where they were, and so forth, but they were running very well, but they had a headache, and they continued to have a headache. And so I just skipped the exteriorization and just started to run HC opening procedure on them. And they lost their headache immediately. This pre-clear, although he could exteriorize, was in no possible condition. They'd exteriorized into another universe, a black universe. They couldn't see. I mean, it's just as easy as that. It was a black universe. I mean, so they couldn't see the room. How elementary can we get? Now, interiorization into universes and interiorization into heads. Your pre-clear, you see, might be interiorized into a universe, interiorized into a bank, and then incidentally connected up and looking with a head. See, you might have several classes. You don't have to worry about this, though, because you've got opening procedure of 8C. Some other thing I was going to mention to you there. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's an old saw that Scientologists are the hardest ones to process. This is true. This is true, with one exception, mystics. Your mystic, he's kind of a rough boy. Well, although 8D is not the finest process in the world, it's a fairly useful process and definitely belongs in there. It is not mentioned in intensive procedure because it really doesn't have a belong in intensive procedure as such. But if you were to strike a mystic, and he kept on figure, and you said to him, all right, now let's see if you can spot a spot in this room, and he figure, and you've run him an hour or so on opening procedure of 8C, and he goes home, and he comes back the next session, and he's all spun in with figure. I've broken the back of some of these cases by running 8D on mystery. Where would mysteries be safe? Where would mysteries find them safe? Just a little point here. Where would mysteries be safe? And boy, they're safe everywhere. What mysticism is just strewn with is the total security of some of the secrets and mysteries and wisdoms. Oh, you talk. Where is this library where all this material is? Well, it's everywhere, and it's indestructible, and nobody could ever do anything to it, and it tells all there is to know, but of course you couldn't go any place or do anything unless you did something about it, but you can't do anything, you know. Now, they've tried to change themselves by practices which didn't work, and therefore mysteries have really gotten safe. See? So although you see in a book which I'm right now compiling, called The Great Teachers of Mankind, although you see an awful lot of material in there from various ages and times, it's not recommended material or practices because it's booby-trapped every single 5 feet of it with mystery. Oh, the tremendous mystery that obfuscates the mystery that obfuscates the mystery. The mystery within the mystery within the mystery that is inside the greatest mystery of all. So don't take that material seriously. It's historically useful. It's interesting. It's bric-a-brac. Just tells what man knew. It's astonishing that he knew so much and could still be so stupid. That's what's astonishing. But you have to know what he should know before you could know what he did know. So don't worry too much about that. And if you get some pre-clear gets hold of this book and he wants to dive in and yogify himself, why, you tell him, go ahead, little boy, it's all right. Pat him on the head and let him go, and so forth. And after he's been trying to stiffen his limbs with the ibis or something of the sort for a long enough period of time, why, you can just run where mysteries would be safe on him and you'll have him out of it. It's a little panacea, which is a good thing for an auditor to know. Now, why is a Scientologist harder to process than anybody else, and what could you run on a Scientologist? Well, I tell you a curious thing. A Scientologist has been trying to change minds, right? And some of the pre-clears he's been trying to, you see, he could do this forever if he just kept winning, but he didn't win all the time. All right, he's tried to change minds and he's failed. Unless you were very relaxed about whether somebody changes his mind or not, why, you can get hooked with this because you are changing somebody's mind, right? But you know the poison in the fang, and you know the antidote for it. Just get the as-isness of the pre-clear. And this brings up a total process, which I promised I'd tell you about, called description processing. Not descriptive processing, that'd be like descriptive geometry, but description processing. And all this and several other types of processes on the same line, but this is a very effective one. All this does is to try to get the pre-clear to get the as-isness of things. And this works madly on a Scientologist. You just get him started describing all the pre-clears he's processed. Now, not necessarily what their mental states were, but what they looked like. You know, where they sat and what happened in the sessions. Get the as-isness of it. It's a terrifically permissive process. It's fascinating that Papa Freud should be so adroit. He certainly was not born with any gangplank in his mouth, because he was always missing the boat. This boy, somebody said, ooh. This boy had the most interesting history of boat missing. He missed boats to Alaska, to China, to Asia, to the Middle East, and so forth. It's a good thing that he got interested in the subject, because nobody else was. But beyond that, we find it fabulous that he would miss as many boats. Do you realize that all of the hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours spent in psychoanalysis are simply devoted to letting somebody associate? Well, that's what's wrong with the patient. He's associating everything with everything until he gets a total identification. He can't differentiate. Well, all right, now let's look at this description processing. If he'd put in all these hours simply asking him to describe everybody he'd known, he would have had well people. You get that? Instead of telling how horrible everybody was to him and looking for the deep significance and changing it all into sex, which perpetuates sex like mad, by the way, it just hangs a pre-clear on bad sex all the way along the line. Alter-isness on the subject of bad sex. We get bad sex and then alter it. And what's that going to make? There's some lines in an old book descriptive of the Veda, which tells the horrible state that Brahmins are going to get into, and it goes on for several pages of invective. But these are mild compared to the state this would get somebody in practicing alter-isness on sex, on bad sex. Well, why didn't he get human? Why didn't he breathe and everything? All he would have had to have done, we know now, is just have him sit there, you see, have the patient sit there and describe Mama and describe Papa and describe them accurately. Not describe anything but the accuracy of the person. Where the person lived, what the person ordinarily wore, how the person looked, the sort of expressions the person used. And he would never have had to do this for 2 years on somebody at 4 hours a week. No, the person would have gotten well, that's all. Now, today, the problem of the ally still could be a baffling thing if it were not for this description processing. And so description processing becomes very valuable to know. This person's having an awfully bad time with an ally, let's say an aunt or something of the sort, you know. They're very occluded, and they apparently are in the aunt's universe. You see, you can get into other people's universes and universes that are real universes, and boy, you can get every place. And we still have somebody who is very occluded and who's having that. Well, we could actually validate the area. It's not as good a process, you see, secondary process. Validate the area where they're stuck just to the degree of getting them to describe it. And this, in terms of allies, can be quite acute because it's an experience shared by the body and the thetan in common. And the way we get rid of an ally today is to sit down and have the pre-clear start describing the ally. We want the physical description of the ally, physical description of the ally's surroundings. We just want more and more description. We're not even interested in whether this person is getting them by picture or anything else. We just want the description. And if we just keep the pre-clear describing, we will eventually find the ally back where the ally belongs and wiped out. Why? You're running as-isness. This is as-isness with regard to this ally. And it's a very permissive, gentle way to slide in to this sort of case. But don't think it isn't a deadly process. This one will turn on somatics of a royal and classic nature, just gorgeous. Well, I've seen them get somatics all over their body. Now, the reason why this is interesting to you is because it introduces another manifestation which has, to date, rather defied a good, solid sweep that would crack it up, and that is recall on past lives. This seems to be blocked in most people quite markedly by between lives areas and limitation of attention and other things. And you just get a person, sit down, and ask them to start describing their last body. And they will go on at some length, only you ask them to be more accurate about this description, and you hound them, and it gets less and less real to them, and less real, and less 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 and less real, and more real, and more real, and more real, and more less and less real, and less and less, and more real, and more and less real, and less real, and less real, and you just keep describing it. And then they'll dig up their past life. Just by description. You see why it works and what your goal is as an auditor. You've got to get the as-isness of that life to knock out some of its unpleasant features so that the person is willing to recall that much unpleasantness. Now, I had a case one time that had a number of wives. This case had a great many wives. It's quite common in this society to have 13 or 14 marriages, but not the number this fellow had. And he had his wives all mixed up. And they were all mixed up with his present wife. And his present wife was getting very unhappy because she was being called by a variety of names. And getting bawled out for a variety of manifestations which she was not manifesting. So the way I handled this case was simply ask this fellow to sit down and start describing wives. And I cut him short on the basis of, well, now, let's see, was that Angus? No, that wasn't Agnes. Was he? Josephine? No, that wasn't Josephine. No, that was the Blizzard of 80. No, that, he just cut out this fog and just make him start describing. We don't care whether, you see, your pre-clear will be mixed up initially. You want him to remember in detail everything about this, and he wants more and more detail. And that isn't what you want at all. You just want him to get the as-isnesses of that person. You know, just as the person is to him. And if he is foggy on the person's name or time or date or something like that, well, that's the easiest thing in the world. Of course, you've got to get the as-isness of the fogginess. So you say, well, if you're foggy about it, stop fishing and simply say, well, you're foggy about it. See? And then just describe it some more. Describe it the way it seems to you. The first description he'll give you, it isn't. And, well, it isn't, but I guess I could make up something. Be totally imaginary. And so on. And they give you this sort of thing, and they're just running out the as-isnesses as nice you please. Now, if you let this fellow practice alter-isness, he'll perpetuate the incident. So it's a cute process. I mean, it's a process an auditor guides with a very, very delicate thumb and forefinger. You want the as-isnesses. You just want him to describe what he now has with relationship to the incident. Not to mock up a bunch of stuff to give you a good description, you see. You just want him to describe the way that seems to him now. And I'll describe how it seems to you now. Describe how that person seems to you now. Describe it some more, so on. Well, the only difficulty that you'll get into with regard to this is this simple, single difficulty, is you're not giving him the time factor always, you see. So you must interject in your description, when does that seem to you? Which seems to be an odd piece of English, But now when does it seem to you? You want to get him the idea of time. What seems, it's an incredibly long time ago. Yeah, an incredibly long time ago. Or it seems just like it was yesterday. Whatever he wants to say about it, that's the as-isness of the memory with regard to that subject. And boy, it's not a fast process, but it has stable results. Because you're using thought all the way down the line. You're using thought. And that gives you a very stable result. By the time I had this fellow describing each one of these women and so on, he'd get hemming and hawing and sitting back and trying to figure exactly whether it was this one or that one or how he did this or that. We are not interested in it. How does it seem to you now? Well, he says, confused. And how does it seem to you now? Well, it's not as, no, it's, as a matter of fact, her name was Agnes. See, he just plows right on through the mess. Well, when does it seem to you you had anything? Oh, golly, 8 or 9 lifetimes ago. I just seems forever, and so forth. Keep him describing, describe when it seems. But describe the way it seems to him, rather than an embroidery on the situation. Next thing he knows, there he's lying out there in the bois with 3 feet of rapier sticking through his gullet, you know? And how does that seem to you? It was too early in the morning to get killed. They shoot their postulates out and everything like that. It's a terrifically permissive method of processing, and about the only method which I would really think of using on a specific thing that I was trying to shoot up with a pre-clear. On a short session, half an hour, something like this, you have to straighten out somebody's mind on some subject or another. And just get him to describe how it seems to him. And trip him every time he starts to embroider. Oh, the thetan will just take this opportunity, you know, to get the bit in his teeth and run like mad. It was a wonderful opportunity. Just think of the mock-ups he could get, the romance he could interject, and how he could suddenly be Mary Queen of Scots, and what an enormous, wide-open door there is here. Well, you just slam the door in his face, and now how does it seem to you? That I would call an office technique. You know, just one that you're patching somebody up with. It's also an interesting party technique. I took a husband one time and got him to describe his wife. And my golly, she was wearing an entirely different dress than she was wearing. And he didn't know the color of her eyes, which is rather common. He was just in a complete fog. She was sitting in the next room, and he had been looking at her for a long time. He couldn't describe her even vaguely, and he just bogged on it. Well, then, now how does it seem to you? She seems awfully vague. And believe me, that was his condition of marriage. Darn vague. He didn't know whether he was married or not. And, of course, that, by the way, in running acceptance rejection processing, such as you've been running recently, the first thing he threw away was his wife. that one he could get rid of. But the funny part of it is he didn't even know who he was getting rid of. This is what turned up. Okay. Well, you've run a lot of processes. You know how to run a lot of processes. So on, remember, each one of these has its place, and don't forget the efficiency and efficacy of exteriorization by distance for polishing up somebody's perceptions and so forth. But don't forget that opening procedure of 8C on collecting somebody is sometimes vitally necessary, and you might have more pre-clear to collect than you know. He must be quite a pre-clear if he can be buttered over this many states, counties, universes, and people and patterns, and still be present at all. See? He must be quite a guy. Well, getting him collected is sometimes quite a stunt. Part of the collection technique is opening procedure by duplication. That is a collection technique. That collects them in with a shotgun. Because it at once breaks their horror of duplicating. So it gets them into better communication as such. But 8C's opening procedure and opening procedure by duplication are both of them tremendously valuable in collecting people in. Okay, any questions? Yes?
How would description work on present time environment?
Oh, it worked just fine. Only you can look at it.
Huh?
You can look at it. Description is mainly useful on environments which the person can't look at the moment. That's where its value is. It'd work on the present time environment, but you'd find it slower than opening procedure by 8C. I'm fairly sure you would.
This would hint at the confusing universe more quickly than AIC straight line.
It described the physical universe. I asked a fellow to do that one time just as a little test. Describe the physical universe, I said. Boy, we got a calm lag. He kept telling me, no, that isn't in this universe. He had devils mocked up in the universe, you know, and no, that isn't in this universe. Well, let's see. And he's trying to find something that was, and he finally found that to him, the town was a little tiny island. It was sitting in the middle of a very dark space, and that was this universe, and had very peculiar fairy tale type houses. And that was the universe he was living in. Okay.